Welcome to Washington Policy on the Go. My name is David Bose. I'm the Communications Director for Washington Policy Center. And this is a special edition live here at our, we're always live, of course, but in person in studio here at our offices in downtown Seattle. And I have two center directors on the interview table today, and that is our Small Business Director. We're going to start with Mark Harmsworth, who's sitting to my right. And we'll also speak with Charles Prestrude, who is our Kohl's Center for Transportation Director, about what's happening in the transportation field in Olympia. So we welcome you and we thank you for joining us. I want to remind you that we do have updates on the legislative session every day. You never know what hour it's going to happen because our center directors are working all the time. Just go to washingtonpolicy.org, check out the latest on our blog, and be sure to pay attention to what's happening in Olympia and the policy that matters to you. If you have questions during any point of this interview today, just enter it in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and those questions will be passed over to me. So try not to use the chat, because the chat's a little harder for us to keep track of there, and there's a lot of back and forth. So use the Q&A box there, enter your questions, and we'll try and get those answered for our center directors. If we miss your question, those questions are given to us, given to the center directors after the program as well, and they'll have a second chance at doing that. Also want to remind you, this program will be available on our YouTube channel. So if you see something you really like there and you want to share, make sure you check out our YouTube channel. We'll also provide clips of that on our Facebook Reels and other programs as well. So, and thank you for advance for sharing, because that helps us spread this information. It doesn't do any good to hide it, right? But we're going to start with our Center for Small Business Director, Mark Harmsworth. Mark, one of the things that you've been watching really closely is the rent control issue. Obviously, there's high concern in Washington State over the price of housing, high concern over the ability of people to make ends meet, much less younger people trying to get a head start in life. So there's all kinds of emphasis on handling this price problem with rent control. First, let's tackle what's wrong with that argument from a free market perspective, and then we'll tackle where this legislation is, HB 1217 in Olympia.
Yeah, so the fundamental problem is housing supply, as you know. It's demand and supply. As you increase the supply, demand goes down and prices go down too. So what they're effectively doing by putting a price cap on there is limiting the supply. And people will say, well, it doesn't necessarily mean you're going to limit the supply. But the issue is that as you put that cap on there, the property owners can no longer afford to rent those units. If you start thinking about the cost of renting these units out, let's say you've got a unit and you're making 5% profit per year after you factor in like a month's rent that you missed because somebody's not in the unit anymore. And then the city comes in and puts in a 5.2% increase on your property taxes, or the utility, your washing machine goes out, or the roof needs to be replaced. So you now have a $10,000, $15,000 extra cost, which you've got to recuperate because you're not doing this for the goodness of your heart, no matter what people will say. And so you have to increase the rent. Now, the 1217, what it does basically is puts a cap at 7%. And then has a whole bunch of restrictions when you increase the rent over 3%. And you heard me say Seattle went over 3% already just in property taxes. Then you start throwing in things like the proposed utility taxes the legislature went after this year. Thankfully, they didn't get them. But you start putting that in there, and it's going to be incredibly hard to reach that cap without exceeding that cap each year. In fact, just yesterday, I got a letter from a distraught property owner that his retirement is these properties. He's been renting them and using the money as income to retire on. And he said he can't do it anymore because of this potential here. He's got some good renters that he's not been increasing their rent because they're good renters. There's a good symbiont relationship there. Right. And instead, he's now going to have to go to the 7% per year. And he's afraid he's going to lose the renters in his home. And then he's not going to be able to make ends meet either. Terrible piece of legislation. What we need to be doing is increasing the supply. And there's many other ways we can do that without putting a cap on rent.
I remember when I was a kid growing up, there was a friend of mine's dad had a house, and that was his ideas for rental income. But when they went to check on the renter, they had stripped the walls of sheetrock and were burning the studs of the walls for winter heat, and they had they had not paid rent for a couple of months. It was just a total disaster. And it was always a reminder that you never know how bad a renter can be and how much, I mean, there was tens of thousands of dollars of damage that they had to fix to get that thing done. And it only takes one of those, to really throw off the economics of trying, like you say, they're not necessarily doing it out of, their own, the blessedness of their own heart. But at the same time, there's a lot of people who, it's like the free market. You're servicing a need, and they see that need out there. And when they have a good relationship with tenants, it's a great symbiotic relationship. It's like you have this need. I don't want to raise your rent because I'd much rather leave you here for as long as possible.
Exactly.
And I met a guy who was in the same place for 30 years. It was that perfect relationship between the homeowner and the renter. And this demolishes that because the lack of freedom, you have to prepare for the worst, even if your renter is the best, and that makes it really difficult. So if instead of this, first I should say the rent control is still alive, right? 1217.
Yeah, it's still alive. It's moving through the House right now. It's a Senate. Excuse me, it's moving through the Senate. It's a House bill.
Okay.
So they have a hearing tomorrow. So if you have any opinions on it, sign up and testify.
And we should make sure that there's a blog today so that we can direct people to, if you want to be heard on this issue, it's an easy click. They can just go straight. So watch for that at WashingtonPolicy.org for that blog later today. So they go there, they click, people can leave their own written messages or they could sign up to actually testify as well. Or you can just say pro con these days. You can say I'm in favor or opposed. But let's set this bill aside. Let's say, Governor Ferguson called and said, Mark, I need the price of housing to go down. What would you do policy-wise to make that happen?
Well, the first thing is permit streamlining. A lot of our rental properties, particularly low-income housing, are burdened with huge regulatory permit requirements. You hear all sorts of numbers, but the average is around $40,000 that it adds to the cost of a home. Well, when somebody builds even an apartment and it adds that much money to the cost of the apartment, the rent has to be significantly higher to cover the cost of the construction. Because again, the developer, no matter what you think of developers, they're not doing this for free. They're trying to make somewhat of a profit so they can continue building more homes. So permits, a huge deal there. The other thing is not passing rent control, obviously, because that's going to reduce the supply. And what we want to do is also look at the property owner and tenant rules right now. They're heavily in favor of the tenant, and it's making a lot of the property owners really nervous, particularly evictions. Seattle has a backlog of a year on eviction. So when you're a good tenant, no big deal. But when you're a bad tenant, the property owner has to get you out of the house.
Let's remember there was that tenant in Seattle who was actually, they were Airbnb-ing the house that they were not paying rent in, the downstairs, while the owner of the house was stuck in his van, living in his van because he couldn't get the tenant out that wasn't paying rent.
Right.
I mean, the insanity of that. And then Spokane, a few years back, but this is not a case where it's a one-off, where you had an elderly couple whose son had an addiction problem. They let the son live in the rental above their garage, and the son, before he passed away, brought two people over, and then they claimed to have tenant rights in there, and they couldn't get them out. They lost tens of thousands of dollars of damage. Their retirement was being drained by these people who would not leave and were also, thieving. So you have these kinds of problems. They sound outlandish, but you hear about them pretty commonly. This is not one of those things that just never happens.
Right.
It's a danger.
Yeah, it happens frequently, and it's a problem. And every time that happens, if it's one property you own, well, you're eating the cost as the owner. But let's say you're lucky enough to have maybe a duplex or a quadplex or something like that, and you've got a bad tenant. First of all, that bad tenant might make the other tenants leave, but let's say they don't. You've now got to recoup the costs and the damage. My dad, for a number of years, owned low-income housing in the UK, and often when a tenant would leave, he would go back in, and similar to the story you told, they would have stripped all the copper out, the heaters, all the wiring, everything out of the house. And it would cost him $4,000 or $5,000 to go back in and replace all this stuff and get it refixed. Well, then he takes that cost and amortizes across the rents of the other properties.
Right.
And the longer you leave it, the more difficult it's going to be, and the cost goes up. So eviction reform, we need that too.
This reminds me of shopping at my local grocer and being in the self-checkout line while they're being very careful to make sure that I passed everything. I said, why is it that you're checking me so closely here for this when I'm literally probably 3 out of every 5 times I go shopping these days, I'm seeing someone leave it with a cart or a backpack full of stuff, so and I know that we're all paying for it, right?
Oh, yeah.
I mean, we're paying for the cages that they keep the detergent in now
Yeah.
and everything that is locked up. And it's the same with rent. If you have lousy tenants that don't pay and the owners are stuck via regulation with keeping those people there who are not paying for that property, which by the way was one of the reasons we had a Revolutionary War, right? You could not station British troops without payment or permission. That was one of the reasons. Now we're quartering just random people and government saying, hey, you get to stay there rent free forever, even though you quote unquote own the property.
Right.
That is not a wise way or a satisfactory way to treat someone who owns that property.
Yeah, exactly.
What about the Growth Management Act? Any changes there?
That's the other thing we can go after. The Growth Management Act, for those that you don't know, is the piece of legislation passed a few decades ago that dictates to local municipalities the housing, the population growth. So there's an organization called the Puget Sound Regional Council that targets the amount of population we think is going to move into the state. You hear all these numbers about, well, we need all these new houses. It's that group that's determining that. And it requires each municipality to add population. Well, the Growth Management Act prevents a city from expanding its borders unless it does annexations, and it also has some infill numbers. So if you're a city like Edmonds, Mukilteo, even my own city of Mill Creek, you're somewhat limited because your borders are butting up against the next city over. So if you're Edmonds and they come in and say you must absorb another 2,000 people in the next 5 years, the only way you can do it is increase your density or annex, and they're locked in, so they can't do that. And so what the Growth Management Act is doing effectively is removing single family homes and putting in apartments, which you see definitely happening. What we need to do is remove those restrictions from the GMA so that we can have controlled growth, because originally it was put in to stop a Los Angeles style suburban sprawl, but not to a point where it's just uncontrolled. And we also need to change it so that it adds local infrastructure, improves the roads. As neighborhoods get built, let's build not just the road that connects to the highway. You got to think about where those cars are going to go at each end, whether that's I-5 or 9 or 4 or 5 or wherever. We need to make the improvements of those intersections. That's not included either. So we need to do some stuff there that'll help people move in and out of these properties, but also allow us to have more buildable land at the end of the day to build these properties.
What about rethinking things like mother-in-law units and other things? One of the things I've noticed, permitting is a difficult and tedious process for people. They might want to add a bathroom or something that makes their basement, especially when they're empty nesters, that makes their basement a rentable unit or something, and that would add, capacity. But it's exceedingly difficult for people to do so. Even if they have a large yard, they can't put on. You might have lots of places with the garages and other things, but they can't put the unit above there. That seems to me to be an area of, you're not radically altering the environment of the neighborhood. Seems like it could add a decent capacity. It's just one of those things. Is that more of a local issue or is that a state also?
Well, the legislature passed something called accessory dwelling unit legislation a couple of years ago. ADUs, as they're commonly termed. And it is like that, where you can take maybe a garage, add in, an extra layer and put maybe a little mother-in-law apartment up there or a little 1-bedroom apartment, bathroom, and so on. And again, cities like the city of Snohomish last year, they tried tacking on a $20,000 fee to connect the sewer and the water of those ADUs that were permitted within their city to the street, which is ridiculous because, as you can imagine, if you've got a garage and you're putting a room above it, it's not going to cost you that much, maybe $40,000 or $50,000. So when the city comes in and the permit alone to connect is $20,000, it doubles the price or 33% of the cost of your home. So we highlighted this as the policy center, and they decided to change tack, thankfully. But there's a bunch of legislation that they could be passed, and they did run some bills this year like this to help streamline the permitting. There was a bill for sales tax relief on ADUs specifically that would have helped, and it didn't go through, unfortunately. So those types of things are critical for us to be able to, where it's appropriate to have ADUs, because sometimes it's not appropriate. They've also got bills to do lot splitting as well. And I'd much rather see sort of local control over a lot of that stuff to decide how these lots can be split and how and when we put ADUs in.
It's difficult because, when you've got a rent control bill like House Bill 1217, it's easy to say, we are going to control the cost. That's an easy message. It's a couple of different steps when you talk about how policy actually impacts the way the real world works. And it requires, two-step thinking. And it's a more difficult message and a more challenging message, but also an essential message. Let's quickly go to the Airbnb bill, Senate Bill 5576. This has shifted a little bit from the House version. It was a 6% tax on anybody daring to have a weekend getaway. Now it's a 4% tax. Where's this headed now, and is it likely to sail through?
It's still alive. It's obviously a Senate bill right now, 4%, so it's in the House right now. And it's literally a 4% tax on Airbnb. So if you wanted to rent your house out as an Airbnb, it's now a 4% tax that sits on top of that you're going to end up paying. So it's just a money grab at this point. It's property you already own.
Yeah.
You're trying to generate income on it, and
you're already paying water, sewer, utilities, property tax,
cable fees, and all the rest of it, internet fees,
taxes on everything that around your
bottled
house,
water fees, whatever.
I'm paying surface water fees for nothing because there's no surface water.
Yeah. And now that state's come in and said, hey, we want another 4%. It's kind of like there was a proposed, thankfully it's dead, but a 2% lodging fee for the World Cup next year that they proposed. And so it's just they see it as easy money because these people are potentially visiting the area, and they can just tax them. They have no choice if they just want to get Airbnb. And it's just a money grab by the state. It's ridiculous.
Well, you briefly mentioned, the desire to have people be able to make decisions locally on zoning and other things. And that brings me to 1380. That was a preemption on homeless zoning issue where, local people sometimes get upset when regional or state authorities say, hey, we're going to purchase this hotel downtown and we're going to house a bunch of people with no restrictions on their behaviors who are addicted to drugs and have other problems. So my understanding is that this bill is now dead. And is any chance of a comeback, or is this one to put in the books?
Well, there's always a chance of this coming back. And you may remember this happened specifically in the cities of Kenmore and Redmond last year, where a local nonprofit came in and wanted to take over some of the buildings and make it transitory homeless housing. And the city of Kenmore, the citizens showed up en masse and rejected the whole concept because it removed local control over zoning within their city. So, the local residents with their elected officials could not then determine what type of city that they were going to have and grow up in. That's what basically happened. This bill preempts that. So the state can now come in and say, okay, we've decided that your downtown core is not going to be a boulevard like in Bothell or Kenmore's, working to revitalize their downtown core. And instead, you're going to have a big homeless hotel there. They can come in and preempt. Thankfully, the bill's dead, but obviously people were thinking about this. And it's about local control at the end of the day, particularly with zoning stuff like this, where the people can decide when and where that happens. It could be that Kenmore decides, what, we do want to do this as a policy, but we don't want to put it right here. Mm-hmm. They may decide to put it somewhere else in the city, and that's perfectly okay. But if they make that decision locally, that's what we need to do. We don't need preemption like this from the state.
That brings us to the property tax, what I've been referring to, the triple tax, which is the changing the property tax, the ability of the increase of the property tax from 1% cap to 3%, thus the triple. Where are we on that? Is that, I have a dead question mark on there.
Yeah, I think the actual policy itself is done for the year. Although it's the legislature, they can bring back whatever they want. However, during the process of writing the budget, it's quite possible that you'll see a budget proviso inserted into the budget along these lines. And they are really clever the way they do their budgeting.
That was my fear right there. Because as soon as I heard it was dead, I was like, well, this is essentially a revenue generating thing, which you can wrap into the budget. And you're a former legislator, you know that it's easier for someone to make a vote to triple the cap on a property tax if it's hidden in a giant budget than it is to have a vote only on tripling the property tax, because then you've got this vote that's very clearly the property tax, whereas in the other one, you can say, I'm saving the children, I'm saving, the elderly, I'm saving
Right.
this. There's all kinds of things in the budget you can say, this is what I'm voting for, but it masks the bad vote,
Yeah,
basically.
it does. So you'll see a lot of appropriations and budgets that talk about literally the text that was in a bill that didn't make it through committee
Yeah.
is inserted into the budget and run out as a budget proviso is what they call them. So it's quite possible you will see it come back. It would allow your local municipality, instead of being capped at 1%, which was passed by initiative by the people, bringing that up to 3%. So they can now do 3% per year. And in addition to that, there's also the bank capacity. So if you have a city council that lives within its means, after a few years, if they haven't raised their taxes, and then you get a council that is kind of spend happy, then they can come back and grab that bank capacity. And so you may see some significant increases to the rate in which property taxes are collected.
That scares me, because it was passed by initiative, but that was pre the ability of the legislature to, or the state rather, to insert language in a ballot measure to say, if you don't, if you were to do this, then these terrible things would happen, which of course is nonsense if you understand that all funding is fungible and the legislature decides that. Well, thank you, Mark. I'm going to have you switch over with Charles, our transportation director. Thanks for coming in for the second Washington Policy on the Go.